sophisticated brand is going to have a strategy that involves all channels and multiple forms of media, right? It's maybe the most established, most valuable use case for AI on the planet. Finding your audience is the hard part. In a lot of ways, your creative has become your targeting. The client owns the definition of value. You got to pick an audience or have them pick you. Like any topic, you scratch it and you learn unbelievable nuances of what makes these companies successful.
Hello and welcome to the AdTech Heroes podcast. I'm your host, John Wallet, and in today's episode, we're going to be exploring topics such as automation at scale, integrated commerce, and how platforms are redefining value and measurement, and what is really being considered an increasingly AI-driven advertising ecosystem. And I'm extremely delighted because I'm joined today by David Kaufman, a VP of Product Management and the head of monetization for product solutions and operations at TikTok. David, that is a mouthful, but that just means that your day job in your day is packed with work. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
It's great to have you. And I know while this is a recorded episode, we're on the front end of a holiday weekend. So I appreciate you making the time to connect with us. I'm really excited for the topic today. And I think being at TikTok, you're in a very unique space and a lot of opportunity and interesting innovation happening in your world. So excited to pick your brain to share with the audience. But here on the podcast, we normally start things off with the guest of honor. And today it's all about you, David. So I want to start there. Tell us a little bit, like what first sparked your interest in joining this insane world of advertising?
There are probably two key moments, actually. One was ancient history at this point when I was a kid, watching TV ads and, discovering that the toys can't actually fly, that sort of a thing, right? And I realized there was really an opportunity to do a little bit better with advertising. And if you flash forward a little bit more to my professional career, I was working in venture capital. We were developing a thesis around, free and open internet. And of course, advertising being absolutely essential monetization and business model to make that successful. So there's a lot of passion for that space. And, the more we got into it, the more complicated and interesting it was. Like any topic, you scratch it and you learn unbelievable nuances of what makes these companies successful. And I would say that was probably the moment that it really captured my professional attention.
So very much anchored around problem solving. So let's dig into that a little bit. I mentioned your title earlier. It's pretty large. What's a typical day like for you? You're talking about being solution oriented. You're talking about monetization. Someone who's, I wouldn't say new to this industry, but who's always kind of envisioned their career in a silo. Talk about what you do and a little bit of how you got to your particular VP role today.
Sure. So the title may be a mouthful, but it really means my job is to deliver value for our customers in the advertising ecosystem. And on a typical day, that could be anything from going really deep into a problem that we're having on the platform that a customer has identified as an opportunity where they'd like to spend against a specific outcome, but they're not getting the results they want. That could be anywhere on the internet, or it could be something specific to our channel. We'll go in and do, product and performance reviews. We want to look at the data and make sure everything's sort of behaving the way we would expect it to be. There's a lot of emphasis on go to market as well. So on a great day, I'll get to spend a lot of time with customers, hearing about what they're trying to do, what the challenges are of their business, the way in which they calculate success. And that allows us to bring our solutions, much closer to the way they determine value, which we think is really an opportunity.
That's great. So that's the feedback loop, right? You're doing things with purpose, with intent, and I think that's really special. And you're in a very unique space, TikTok, and the environment that you guys own and are part of. There's a lot of opportunity for growth. There's a lot of opportunity for innovation, and part of the innovation these days is all about automation, right? And the advancement of AI is very much about frictionless capabilities. How do we get from A to B quicker, smarter? And I think when we had our pre-call, we talked a little bit. You said one of your main goals is how do I eliminate any friction between the client's investment and ultimately that business result, right? So where do you still see a lot of that friction in today's buying and creative workflows? And what are you engineering or thinking about at TikTok to help support some of that cause?
Yeah, there's so many sources. If you'll indulge me for just a second, what I would observe is back in the earlier days, of the ad tech ecosystem, if you did not have a fully staffed ad ops team, it was almost impossible to get anything done. You needed to manage, multiple external platforms. You needed to adapt your strategies everywhere. And over the last 15 to 20 years, we've made a lot of progress. In the last 2 years, I think there's been a real acceleration in what you can get done with automation, directly on the platform. So to answer your question very directly, coming up with the idea of what's going to be successful, is one of the areas that like AI has been monumental in terms of change. You want to generate a script, we could do that for you. You want to generate the video assets directly from a prompt, we could do that for you as well, right? So the entire creative production process has really been streamlined. And then this is further enhanced because we have, maybe the best creator ecosystem in the world. You get direct access to these people who have the audiences that you're trying to reach and have built sort of a trusted voice in those ecosystems that you can engage with and get your message out. So the creative aspect of it is going through some pretty intense, changes right now, and we're on the forefront of a lot of that. If we look at, sort of the more classic media side of the equation, how do I find my audience? How do I select that? Do I want to do it very manually where, maybe I'm uploading a CRM file of my highest value customers for a retargeting campaign based on recent purchase behavior? I could do all of that manually, or I can turn on, automation and say, hey, the system should just find highest value customers and let that run automatically. So I think, as you look across all of the aspects of what makes a marketing campaign successful, we want to give the customer access to full automation with our best available intelligence, or the ability to make those decisions for themselves if they're trying to execute a very precise media strategy.
Got it. And at the center of that sounds like you're still not allowing, I shouldn't say that, but you're still giving control in the hands of the advertiser or the customer, right? You're giving them the lens to say, which avenue are you looking to go down? Like what's going to benefit your business? And you have the tools and the capabilities now to allow for that flexibility. And I think
That's exactly right.
that's great. Awesome. And I think what's interesting too, you touched on a little bit is going back to the uniqueness of TikTok. And, I just got back from the Cannes Lions Creativity Festival, and it was all about the creator economy, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how are you guys converting this. Let me take a step back real quick. I think that we're conscious as an industry and as a world now, the influence that AI has in the creative space, right? And there's always this fear that it's going to not just monopolize, but circumvent human characteristics. But I think what we're actually seeing, especially coming out of Cannes this year, is the human element is the most imperative part of the equation, right? And AI is really just meant to help empower that, right, and help to enrich it. And do you feel like not just do you feel, but how else are you guys exploring avenues of that? I think you mentioned some other solutions and areas previously, like Smart Plus for automation for performance at scale. How does that play into the creation or creator economy? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. So the way I would look at this is the entire ecosystem is evolving very, very rapidly. And I think there's, there's certainly a lot of excitement around AI. And when you start getting pragmatic about it, you get several different use cases are evolving. So one, let's start with AI in advertising is not scary at all, right? People have been doing ranking, which we used to call machine learning and now we're calling AI for quite a while, right? It's maybe the most established, most valuable use case for AI on the planet. That's evolved. Exactly. Exactly. Back when I ran my startup, we'd find these little insights manually with correlation analysis that like people who bought candy bars in bulk also bought home exercise equipment, that had high commission rates. So those little insights now all exist through AI and they're trapped in the delivery mechanisms. And so one of the things that's really interesting is, we're expanding beyond that use case, which everyone sort of skips over, to things like creativity. Like what do you want to have? Well, if you look at the creative assets directly, there's some very important use cases which are pretty small, right? Like, can we fix the asset ratios of images that are being given to us? Can we do color correction? Can we do overlays for promotional periods against a multi-$100,000 asset catalog? Like, those are things that would be incredibly difficult to do without AI, and they're very minor use cases. Then, as we talk about Can and the creator economy, we get into the really exciting stuff, right? So, our Symphony platform is where TikTok has its generative AI capabilities. So if you wanted to create a digital avatar from scratch to help promote a product or explain a service, you certainly can do that. We can also work with the TikTok One platform to deeply engage those creators very directly and harness their creativity and think about the ways in which you can deliver, a more powerful message. And one of the ways we're trying to make that more accessible is actually through, let's call it an agentic buying flow, right? The Symphony agent, right? So it used to be that if you wanted to find a creator who was maybe interesting for you, you did your research by living in social media. You found people who were interesting, you might reach out to them directly or try to find their business manager, those sorts of interactions, highly manual. Now you can explain the problem you want directly to the agent on our platform, and it will go identify creators that are relevant for you based on all of the trending information on our platform. It will suggest outreach, it will suggest briefs. You can think about the ways in which you'd like to engage those creators, look at their histories and the types of audiences they have. So a lot of this is just making the entire ecosystem much more accessible, much more easily. And that kind of comes back to your point about how we're reducing friction in the ecosystem that I think is really exciting. One of the areas that is also really interesting, you mentioned, our Smart Plus platform, some of the ways we're doing automation to provide, performance-based solutions, right? So Smart Plus, in its most ideal state, can have a, very large catalog of products trying to show the right product to the right person in the right format on our platform. And what you might want to do is expand from something that you would have used, 5, 10 years ago, which might be just a static image of a product against a white background, kind of like me in this shot, to something that actually engages the creator ecosystem. How would they explain the services? How can they enrich this? And we have a number of efforts related to the affiliate creative space. So if you run a TikTok shop, for example, you can harness the creator ecosystem to make content specifically around your products. And that's another way in which I think we're harnessing the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating part of what you guys are doing, the integration of the commerce into the full funnel, right? The whole spec of what you guys are achieving. I want to go back later on to the idea of brands being able to go in and not just have creators develop content for them, but actually developing their own avatar. I'm so curious to hear, not just adoption of that, but, market receptivity to those things. But that's a later conversation. I want to stick with the TikTok shop for a minute, because I think, bringing commerce directly into the platform is very powerful, specifically for TikTok. How do brands start to think about, activation and performance through that lens? Because, I think early on, the gravitational pull towards TikTok was very much a branding equity kind of vehicle. And now we're saying there's so much more that could be done in this platform. So how are you bridging that gap? How are you showing brands the best way to enter into that world?
Yeah, this is really a really important question. As you identified, I think the platform's history was really with short form video, where we were a leader, and we've now expanded to offer, a whole variety of business objectives and use cases on the platform. A lot of them increasingly are related to performance. And so with TikTok Shop, you think about the user journey being collapsed, right? It used to be I'd see an ad, I might click it, I'd go to a website, I'd register, I'd sign up for an account, I'd put in my payment information, I'd add something to cart, complete the checkout flow, right? Every one of those clicks is friction you don't necessarily need. And there's a fall off in the number of users who complete that entire journey, right? Much simpler if you see the product on the platform, you like it, you click it, you buy it, and you're done, right? So the power of that, direct commerce, at the point of discovery can't be overstated. It's really a monumental change in the ecosystem. And the way brands are engaging with it depends a lot on the size and the mechanics of their business. So if we were to focus on the SMB world for a second, the small, medium businesses, about 7.5 million of these here in the US are taking advantage of TikTok solutions. For them, this is another channel, right? They might manage their own website, they might not. It's very easy to get integrated commerce up on the platform and become a primary driver of their businesses as these transactions occur, naturally as people discover their products and offerings on TikTok. If you're, an established retailer, we're seeing a tremendous amount of success with brands coming on maybe one category at a time. So we're seeing a lot of particular prowess with health and beauty. And if you think about some of the mainstream content that the creators and our users are generating on our platform, that's an area where there's a lot of engagement. Things like the get ready with me, or let me do a hair and makeup tutorial. There's a lot of content around that. The third one I'll mention is maybe, for very large businesses that don't have a direct to consumer presence. This is a really exciting offering. So if you're a CPG company, and you'd like to introduce a new product, this is a phenomenal way to test things. What sort of engagement do we get on a new flavor of snack, or what sort of engagement do we get on a new branding opportunity with this beverage? We've seen a lot of that, product test use case on TikTok Shop from some very large companies, and you get a lot of immediate feedback. Right now, there's a challenge, right? In the back end, you have to manage fulfillment, or you can work with TikTok. But those are areas where we're seeing a lot of diversity in how people engage with Shop, from SMBs that might see it as a primary channel, retailers that are trying to accelerate specific categories, or even very, very large international CPG companies that are doing a hybrid of like sales and market research.
Very cool. And the entry point for that is pretty low cost, right? That's a great way to test new products. And like you said, if you're a small business opportunity, it's low lift in that sense. Is that how you kind of think about it? Like if I'm an emerging brand, you could jump into this pool quite seamlessly, right?
Absolutely. I think, one of the lessons back from when I was an entrepreneur, we were doing a lot of distributed e-commerce and sharing product data around the social visual web. We worked with a lot of clients who thought building the website was the hard part. It's not, right? Finding your audience is the hard part. So if you want to do this on TikTok Shop, we take care of that for you. Between the platform itself, the users, and the creator ecosystem, you can find your audience instantly, which gets you much faster results.
Yep. So let's touch on this a little bit, and I love the momentum towards commerce or integrated commerce here. Kind of living in your own walled garden though, TikTok, right? How do you expand beyond that, right? How do APIs and AI and measurement solutions help evolve that? What are ways that you guys are bridging the gap beyond the walls of just TikTok?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I think any developing user platform is going to have their origins in just kind of building their thing and experimenting and looking at the data, making sure they improve the user experience, right? Because ultimately, the value we're able to deliver to advertisers is based on our users enjoying and engaging on the platform. So we're very inwardly focused at that stage of development. Particularly when you get more serious about monetization and your participation in the monetization ecosystem, it's important to recognize you work with a collection of partners that are all trusted by your customers, the advertisers, who want to make, holistic decisions. And, as much as any one platform might want to be the sole source of traffic and revenue, a sophisticated brand is going to have a strategy that involves all channels and multiple forms of media. And as a result of that, they need a way to measure and track their progress. So we really think about, last year and this year and our future being a, large player in the ecosystem, building these bridges, making sure you have access to the platform. Now, in some cases, that happens through working with trusted measurement partners so that you can evaluate in your own terms, what the performance looks like. And we can give you a holistic view, right? So if you are a Smart Plus customer, you can go to TikTok Ads Manager. You'll be able to see reports that show the sales and what your return on ad spend might be. If you are running parallel campaigns and you want to use a multi-touch attribution vendor to make some determinations against that, you can use those things together to understand a more complete picture of value, right? If we move out of that space and we start thinking about, how AI might help us in this environment as well, we're at the very forefront of a really interesting period, right? It used to be, that maybe you would need to get the campaign management API set up on your internal tool systems in order to do anything. And that's still a great way to go. If you'd like to be deterministic and you want to program business logic against the API and handle your buying flows that way, you absolutely can. On the other hand, maybe you want to experiment with the MCP offering that we announced back at TikTok World in May. You might have an agent that's trained on your business logic that can connect directly to our ads platform and manage all of this for you actively. And, there are pros and cons to these approaches, right? So I think the most sophisticated advertisers are doing a little bit of everything to figure out, what's going to absolutely work for them. But, in terms of our commitment, we want to be a good player in the advertising ecosystem. If you want to use third party, validation, third party measurement, you want to think about third party audiences, and use one of your trusted identity partners. All of that is infrastructure that we have available for.
That's great. And I think that was an interesting topic coming out of Cannes as well. I think that the dust has settled a little bit on the excitement, and we talked. Let's use the acronym again, AI, but it's modeling, right? And now it's more about, I'd say, the validation or the proof of that concept. And measurement was a big topic of conversation, and almost nearly every panel I was privy to sit through. And I think one of the things that brands were very conscious of was finding a measurement partner that's not kind of not checking their own homework. So having the flexibility to work outside of your own line, to being able to bring in partners, third party that can validate, I think is super important to a lot of the clients getting comfortable with a lot of these workflows and performance based campaigns. So as we come to a little bit of the tail end of our conversation, there's one area that we spoke about prior to our meeting today, and that was kind of shifting the presence of TikTok, right? We know that in recent history, TikTok, you invested heavily in premium placements like Top View, which seems to appear when users open the app. Like, what other areas or what role do you think premium formats are beginning to play in your broader monetization strategy? And what does that look like when you start to swim into the lanes of like linear TV, if that's coming?
Yeah, so this is such an important question. TopView is one of the products that we see a lot of success with, and particularly if you think about an advertiser who's trying to get very high share of voice on a specific moment that matters to their business, this is a great solution. We obviously have very high creative standards around that product because it's the very first thing you see when you open the application. We've actually expanded it a little bit more. So one of the things we have now is the ability to take over the logo screen when you first launch. So we've worked with a couple examples. When Warner Brothers launched the Supergirl trailer originally, they were one of our first partners to experiment with this solution. And you would see the Supergirl emblem fly in and sort of take over the TikTok logo itself. It was a pretty cool experience. As we think about some of the other premium offerings that we have, we've been working very closely on our Pulse suite. This is the solution suite that allows advertisers to place content adjacent to specific themes that they talk about. Right now we've got the World Cup going on, very exciting opportunity, for soccer fans, football fans around the world, to really engage. And actually I've been enjoying some of the ancillary benefits of watching the World Cup on TikTok. There's a lot of, people experiencing the US for the first time and falling in love with ranch dressing and
Oh, it's
things
the
like
best. I saw that one. That was a
that.
good one. Yeah.
This is ranch conquers the world.
Was
So
that was a German? I think it was a Germany fan, right? They're like, "What are you taking back with you?" And he's like, "Bottles of ranch." I'm like, "Wow, good on you,
yeah,
buddy."
I've seen that one, or some of the folks from the UK have like an entire suitcase full of these bottles, right? And and it's anyway. I love these little moments of joy I get from the platform. But as you look at those opportunities, right? The world is really coming together around this event, and we have the ability to put sort of World Cup content as a Pulse offering. There, people can buy this. This is what we call Pulse Premier, and a lot of advertisers are engaging in that ecosystem to make sure that their brand is adjacent to perhaps an event that they're sponsoring on other channels or their official sponsor of, and that they get that placement, that highest quality content, that brand affinity that they're looking for being activated here. And as you said, that's the sort of thing that historically has been on other media, right? That's you think about marquee moments on television, you think about maybe some of the premium glossy placements back in the print era. We're really trying to create an experience where advertisers get that same level of brand safety, brand awareness, the high quality content feel adjacent to the content that they care about in our feed. So continuing to make those sorts of offerings is really important. And to the point that you made a moment ago, when we're sort of thinking about how to convince an advertiser that the premium offerings on a social platform like TikTok or as good or even better than maybe what they've done historically, we have to be a part of their measurement ecosystem. We have to design our solutions to resonate, with what they understand, whether that's running, surveys on our platform to give them direct results about brand affinity or recall, lift and recall, or it's something like working with their media mix models and their in-house business intelligence teams to really deeply understand how they define value so that we can tune our systems to deliver for them in their own terms. Use the checking your homework, I think was the line you used. That's maybe the more polite version of some of the metaphors that I've run into. And we think it's really important. The client owns the definition of value. We want to work to make sure you realize it.
Yeah, and going back to some of that, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you've seen recently, especially with the World Cup, as it comes to how TikTok provides benefits to brands with second screen behavior while users are watching this event. Have you seen specific metrics that you're coming up right now where there's success stories, or are you still in the midst of uncovering some of that insight?
I can't share direct numbers on this one, but I would say we're seeing phenomenal engagement around World Cup content. We're getting a lot of very positive feedback from our advertisers. If we rewind a little bit, to the big game for football, we did a analysis basically minute by minute, kind of looking at how user behavior versus the game interacted. And what we learned was there is a real spike in engagement on TikTok during the ad breaks during the game. And so one of the things that's really interesting is thinking about, maybe a complementary advertising strategy. If you're a major sponsor of that sort of an event, you probably want to be running your content on TikTok because there's a good chance people are taking their eyes off the screen to engage on TikTok, the very second your content's coming up. Exception for Bad Bunny. We did see a little bit of a drop in engagement on our platform
Yeah,
during the
I bet.
halftime show.
I bet.
Um,
Yeah, I think everyone was tapped into that no matter what. That was a very special moment. Okay, I love this. I really appreciate you sharing a lot of these insights and some of the new innovation and processes going on over at TikTok. And I want to go back to the avatar comment from earlier. Just I'm very interested in it because I think it's a very interesting advancement in generative AI, and just curious to get your thoughts if you're willing to share of how brands are leaning into adopting an avatar as opposed to a creator, a historical creator, to support their brand. Like, what's that adoption look like, and how are brands leaning into some of that space?
Well, I would say the adoption on the creator ecosystem is incredibly strong, and these things really serve different use cases. So if you think about the creator ecosystem, you're trying to harness, their insights, their voice, the way that they think about engaging with their audience, and the unique way they may look at your product, right? So that authenticity is really essential, to your media strategy when you engage with the creator ecosystem, right? If you're looking at something like an avatar for generative AI, you're probably going after a different use case, right? You've defined an audience separately, right? You have a specific group that you're trying to reach, or you're trying to hit some critical mass of variety to maybe test the value proposition of your solution to see what resonates. And it's a lot easier to do that with generative AI, because you try, an infinite variety of options, relatively quickly versus, bringing the camera crew out or waiting for the production timeline. So I think they both serve a place in the ecosystem. And certainly I think we're going to continue to develop, some of the generative AI capabilities that we get excited about. But I would sort of say a lot of the feedback we get is excitement around what creators can do. In a lot of ways, your creative has become your targeting, right? You're going to let your message find the audience for you on the platform, and the creator ecosystem and the authentic view that they bring really helps.
That's great. I love that. Thank you for indulging me on that question. I was very curious about it. So David, we're at the tail end here. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Here on the show, we usually end it with, and well, there's two major questions I normally ask, but I'm going to go with this one for you, and feel free to answer, or we can pivot. But being an ad tech hero and having a superpower in ad tech, what would that be? What would you consider your superpower in the space that you own in advertising?
Um, Thank you. That's a generous question. I guess the there are two that really come together. One is, we started this conversation talking about the customer feedback loop. That's something that I take very seriously, and I've really invested a lot of time in. And I think a natural byproduct of that is you have sort of a broader view, a non-siloed view of what success means in advertising. A lot of the folks we talk to, they're deeply focused on targeting, or they're deeply focused on optimization, or, they see measurement as kind of the end all be all. And to be successful in advertising, you need it all, right? You got to pick an audience or have them pick you. You need a business objective. You need to measure it intelligently. You need creative, that really resonates and diversifies, who's going to engage with you. You want to apply automation thoughtfully. There's a whole plethora of parameters you need to get right to be successful with advertising. And I think those listening tours and really engaging with customers about how does their business model get represented, through ads, that's the thing that I really enjoy. And I think it's kind of given me this broad perspective on success.
Great answer. I really appreciated that. David, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us today. And we want to keep you in our back pocket because we'd love to revisit some of this conversation or future innovation that you guys have in the future episode. So enjoy the holiday weekend, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John. I really, really enjoyed the conversation as well. And I hope you have a wonderful 4th.